Good day. My name is Travis Bembenek. I'm the owner and CEO of Mexico News Daily. I'm joined by my friend George Revis. Good day, George.
Buenos dias, Travis.
All right. So today we're going to talk about a pretty hot button issue throughout Mexico over the last few months, and that's gentrification. And I think it's not just gentrification, but it's really gentrification and this broader question of immigration of foreigners to Mexico. Do you think you have any ideas or thoughts on that topic, George?
You know, we've talked about this a lot on our other social media stuff, not just on the podcast. And I have kind of a lot of opinions on it, and I want to break it down because you wrote a great article, I thought, which some found slightly controversial, where you were saying that Mexico actually needs a lot more Americans to move here. And you brought up some cool stats that I think a lot of people don't sort of think about in your article. And you basically said that the U.S. population is made up of, I think, over 12% of Mexicans. The overall broader population is 12% Mexican. Whereas here in Mexico, the total foreign population is around 2%. So it is 6 times higher in the States than it is in Mexico, which I found very interesting. And then you sort of went on to say that, in fact, Mexico actually needs more foreigners, more Americans to move and live in Mexico. You reference things like a bit of a stagnant economy, very slow GDP growth. And one of the ways out of that slow GDP stagnant economy was for foreign investment, not just foreign investment, but foreigners moving here and tourism and, spending their money here.
I knew that would be controversial, right? An American owning a newspaper covering Mexico and having a title saying maybe Mexico needs more Americans, I knew would be somewhat provocative. But we have to understand where there's two things happening, right? At a local level, Mexico City had a series of protests over the last few months. So there was 3 or 4 different weekends that there were pretty small groups of a couple hundred people organizing, anti-gentrification, which turned into a little bit anti-immigration protests. Those got a lot of coverage nationally and internationally. And then the second thing, I think, and we see this in comments and hear it, I hear it from friends and family, given the sentiment around immigration around the world, right? So a lot of countries are struggling with questions around immigration, whether it's the US, Canada, Germany, UK, France. They're asking, what's it like in Mexico? Is Mexico still a welcoming place for foreigners? Can I consider living there, or has the game changed there as well? And I think that's why, you and I wanted to talk about this today.
Yeah, that's a great point, because right after the protests were, I think, in like early July, right? Mm-hmm. And we live in Mexico City for the summer. So the protests happened like 3 or 4 days before we were moving back to Mexico City for the summer. And, my wife was like nervous about, oh my God, there's all these protests. What's it going to be like? And, we have a lot of friends from Sayulita who also go to Mexico City for the summer. And, my phone was kind of ringing off the hook like, oh my God, what's it going to be like? And, we got there and it was like nothing had changed, right? Yeah. There was some leftover graffiti that you could see, but the overall vibe, it just didn't feel like we were anticipating it, feeling like there's going to be this negative energy, whatever. And I think that's kind of important for people to understand, right? That was kind of a small section, very small amount of people in, a couple neighborhoods, but the overall sentiment is not, you don't feel like it's gringo go home at all.
Right. But it is important to separate the two, right? Because I think gentrification, which is a label placed on, the foreign, population coming into Mexico, and immigration are really two different things, right? So the Mexico City protests, again, it was gentrification in name, but then had some flavor of anti-immigration, right? But the thing that was being protested was, as has happened in many cities around the world, is the cost of living in some of these, very desirable neighborhoods in Mexico City has just gotten too high, right? And so, cost of living has gone up a lot. Airbnb has moved in and purchased apartments, which has further limited the supply. And then there's, because they're attractive places, more and more people are coming in than ever. And so, that's sort of the real genesis of what those protests were about.
Yeah, and you bring up a very interesting point, which I want to get back to. You said gentrification versus sort of immigration. And, gentrification by definition is just, it doesn't have to be immigrants. It could be anybody. It could be Mexicans moving into, neighborhoods and, that are now cool and sort of forcing up rents and driving out people who have lived there forever. It doesn't necessarily have to be immigrants who are creating the gentrification. And I think in Mexico City, it was both. It was certainly, immigrants, but it also was a lot to do with just whatever, wealthier Mexicans also moving into those neighborhoods, Condesa, Roma, whatever. However, the protests, and this is back to your point, were not geared toward just gentrification and the rich Mexicans coming in and moving into those neighborhoods. It was specifically geared toward the foreigner, specifically the gringo, writing on the walls, gringo go home, things like that, which isn't necessarily a gentrification issue. That's more of an immigration issue.
Well, I mean, you see that around the world, that protests, sometimes it's even hard to understand exactly what they're protesting because it ultimately turns into, a half a dozen issues being protested. I think in Mexico City, after those protests, I think it's good for people to understand that the response from politicians, and when I say politicians, I mean local Mexico City politicians, as well as the president, Claudia Sheinbaum, the response was the government needs to look at policies to make housing more affordable. It wasn't the government needs to look at potentially removing foreigners, right? So, which is very different in some countries around the world right now. The government is interpreting this anger of its citizens as we need to look at immigration policies. And that again was absolutely not in any way what was referenced by politicians here in Mexico.
Right. Another thing too, and why some of these, what they called these, anti-gentrification protests, which, we're sort of dissecting, and maybe it's more of an anti-immigration protest versus gentrification a little bit. But, I think a lot of that, me and you, Travis, have talked about this, is sort of based on the way that Mexicans and other immigrants in the States are now being treated under the new administration, under the Trump administration, right? And, it's kind of a nightmare up there, right? Mexicans and immigrants are basically living in fear. ICE is, just doing basically abominable things all over the, city streets in America. And, the immigrants are just totally living in fear. And I think that is now, sort of what has created this sort of new wave of anti-immigrant sort of stuff in Mexico. And I don't think it's bad, you know what I mean? But I think a lot of it has to do with that the way that the U.S. is looking at Mexican immigrants now in the U.S. is having an effect on how Mexicans are viewing U.S. or other foreign immigrants in Mexico. And it just angers them. And they're just like, this is a double standard and unfair and pissed off.
I mean, I said differently, I think putting aside the complexities of the immigration discussion, there was a general feeling that Americans were generally welcome of Mexicans into their country and Mexicans were welcoming of Americans into Mexico, right? I mean, that was just sort of, again, putting aside immigration status and legal status and all that. There's just a feeling of sort of neighbors, brother and sisterhood between the two countries. And that definitely has changed, as you described. Now, even though it's changed, and I know it hurts a lot of Mexicans personally and emotionally and in their families, I haven't felt it here personally, right? I think the Mexicans I've spoken to, and it's hundreds and hundreds of them, have been able, at least to this point, to separate policies by the current administration and just Americans in general, right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
I don't feel it taken out against me.
I totally agree with that. It's also different when you live here and you've, established all these relationships with tons of Mexicans. Like, of course I have too. And no, they don't look at me any different. I'm still the same asshole,
Well, and I mean, the same way, when I lived in the United States, I absolutely welcomed the diversity and benefits of immigrants in my community. I feel like Mexicans generally feel the same way. They feel like their community is made better with diversity of incoming immigrants. They're proud that immigrants are choosing their neighborhoods and their country. And that's not to say it doesn't come without issues, right? But you referenced right off the bat sort of the foreign-born population in Mexico is about 2%. And even where I live here in San Miguel de Allende, it's about 10%, right? So arguably the most gentrified, most foreign city in the country, it's still only 10%. And as you referenced, just the Mexican population in the United States is 12%. Foreign-born immigrants in the U.S. is 16%. And just to not make this a U.S.-Mexico conversation, in Canada, the foreign-born population is 22%, Germany 21%, UK 17%, France 14%, and again, in Mexico, we're at 2%. Now, a lot of people might say, well, yeah, but look at the problems in the countries I just named due to so much immigration. I'm not here to discuss or debate that. What I am saying is 2% in Mexico is really damn small compared to just about any other, leading country in the world.
Totally. And the foreign-born population of Mexico City is less than 0.5%, which is almost nothing.
And I mean, I don't know like New York City, but I mean, I think it's something like 50%, right? So, I mean, when you get to these big cities where there's just massive diversity, it's usually even higher percentage of foreign-born. And as you said, in Mexico City, it's a rounding error. So important to keep that in mind. I think it's still a very small percentage. And so I guess, George, do you feel sort of anti-American sentiment anywhere where you go? I mean, have you seen examples? Have you felt it ever or heard comments?
Not really. That this is sort of the problem of social media though, right? Like in real life, do I see that? Have I experienced it? Not really at all. Do I see people, online on TikTok and Instagram trying to start shit because that's what people do online? Sure. But in the reality, real life reality, no, I haven't seen that sort of at all. And whether that be in Mexico City, whether that be in Sayulita, in Puerto Vallarta, whatever. Let's talk a little bit, Travis, about sort of the good versus the bad of gentrification. Like there are some positive things that happen with gentrification, right? And there's also some negative. Everyone focuses kind of on the negative. So, just tell us a couple that you've seen, like in San Miguel, like what are some of the positive things of gentrification? And I think, we'll talk about the negative, but those, speak for themselves.
Sure. I guess I'd start by saying I'm always amazed at the grace with which the Mexican community in San Miguel and in the other communities I've spent time in the country receive the foreign-born population. And why do I say that? If you think about, stereotypical immigrants coming into the United States, and I know a lot of people will disagree with what I'm saying, but they're generally going there, they're younger, they're families, and they're going there to work and have a better life. Right now, of course, people would say, no, they're going for the benefits and to vote so that, Democrats are permanently in power. But I think that's a bit cynical. So I would say generally they're going there to find work, live a better life for their families, and ultimately send a lot of money back to their remaining family members in their home country. Now think about Mexico. Many, still there's tons of families coming here. There's tons of younger people. There's digital nomads, but still the majority are retirees, right? So they're not coming here to work. They're coming here to just relax and enjoy life in many cases, right? And so, I appreciate and I guess I think it's important to point out the grace with which Mexicans are receiving generally much wealthier people into their communities, right? That's the other thing. In the United States, the immigrants coming in often, especially the Mexican and Latin American immigrants, are at a much lower economic class. And so that's different than when people are coming into your country and into your community and into your neighborhood at a higher economic class and making you feel poor, right? A friend of mine.
Yet still being graceful about it.
Yeah, that's what I mean. And
right.
Still having grace and being polite and warm and accepting. So I think, you asked, well, what are the benefits? I mean, the Mexicans I know and talk to are very cognizant of the fact that their communities net are improved by foreign-born immigrants coming into their communities, right? They create jobs through the services they need, the purchases they make. They're very cognizant of that and welcoming. And again, that's not said from a dumb gringo perspective who speaks 2 words of Spanish. I mean, I know this country well. I speak the language very fluently. And I know when someone's being sarcastic about, thanking you or when they're genuine about it. And, there's just a genuine recognition. San Miguel people joke that they say if it wasn't for foreign-born people in our community, we'd be like, and I'm not going to name the other communities, but they name some surrounding communities that they think are really boring. So, they generally think, a lot of positiveness comes to the community. Mexico City, I've heard many Mexico City residents say, because of the foreign-born population coming in, our restaurant scene has improved. You see more nightlife, more variety of people out and about, and they're excited about it. Again, there's a point of pride that people from around the world are choosing their community to live. Again, not trying to be oversimplistic and saying, that people aren't suffering from price increases and rent increases through that process. I'm just trying to speak in general terms.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too that I think sort of like early stages of gentrification can be good, right? They sort of transform neighborhoods a little bit. They have some positive impacts. And then I think at some point there's kind of a tipping point, right? Where the gentrification, it goes overboard. And then, I've talked about this with you, Travis, in my neighborhood in Mexico City, where, all the hardware stores and little tiendas that have been there for 50 years are turning, one by one into coffee shops that sell $5 coffees now, and that's obviously on the other side of the tipping point. But sort of that early gentrification where, neighborhoods start to get redone, maybe that weren't as desirable, whatever, maybe not Mexico City, because I think Condesa and Roma were pretty much always, not always, but, desirable for a long time. But in other cities, right, a lesser neighborhood, like let's take Brooklyn or something, in the 90s, and then people start moving in and gentrification makes it a super cool neighborhood, and then it goes a little bit too far, and now it's like the hipster capital of the world, and you don't want to be there.
Exactly. I think we should just think of the takeaways for people, right? Because, our listeners here, because at the end of the day, they want to understand, look, if I'm going to pick up and move, permanently or part of the year to another community, I want to make sure I feel welcome. I don't want to feel like people don't want me there. And I think so, as George and I have discussed, that's not going to be the case. That being said, Mexico is changing, and Mexico is changing fast, right? You've got more and more foreigners for all the reasons we know, and especially Americans and Canadians considering Mexico or moving to Mexico. But then you have the wealth effect in Mexico as well, where the middle class is bigger, the upper class is bigger. And so these desirable areas, whether they're beach resorts in the Caribbean, beach resorts in the Pacific, central cities throughout the country, or neighborhoods in Mexico City, there is more and more pressure on prices because demand is increasing. And so, what you can do as you consider these places, first of all, I don't think you should be scared or concerned, as we've discussed, but there are things you can do to be I guess I'd say a better immigrant coming into the country, right?
Totally.
And I think that's the important point.
Super important.
If you come down and your only goal is to shop at Costco and you drink coffee at Starbucks, that's your prerogative, but then understand part of probably why you chose the community and why you like it is going to change. And so, the way I try to always debate with people is I ask them, what % of what you buy is sort of from local vendors, right? Because I found some people don't even think of that. They just go into a Costco once every 2 weeks and literally do all their shopping of everything there. And then they come back to Central San Miguel and they say, oh, I love it. All these little vendors, they don't ever buy anything there, but they love it. And they're just not understanding that the inconsistency in their behavior and what it's going to potentially.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And back to what you were saying too, how you're treated is depends on how you act, right? So you come here, you respect the culture, you respect the people, you attempt to learn Spanish, you practice your Spanish, you assimilate, and that if you do that, you're going to have a very different experience than if you come down here, you don't speak Spanish, you don't assimilate to the culture, you don't immerse yourself. And if you're not going to do that, I would say don't come. You can go anywhere, really. This is an amazing country,
Exactly.
Not just because sometimes it can feel less expensive. Mexico has a lot more to offer than that.
Yeah, and I think getting back to my article, my controversial article that you referenced at the beginning, that Mexico maybe needs more Americans. Part of what I was getting at there as well is, using your Brooklyn example. Entrepreneurs moved to Brooklyn. It wasn't just people moving there. It was people moving there and creating jobs, creating businesses, right? Creating a community there. And I think Americans, Canadians, foreign-born in general, as they're coming at younger ages, they can not just enjoy the community, but actually really contribute to it by starting businesses or partnering with locals and creating businesses or things like that. So that's why I made the point that, if you start with the premise that a good flow of immigration into your community is a net positive, as long as it's not overwhelming and overwhelming prices and social services and things like that, I think that's good. And so if you start at the point of how low the current immigration population is in Mexico, I think there's huge opportunity for people to come here, live here, make a big impact in the community and be absolutely welcomed with open arms.
No, I agree. Any closing thoughts, Travis?
No, I think that, you said it best a few minutes ago. Just really be skeptical of what you see on social media.
Yeah.
You see a protest and you're seeing one block, or you're seeing one thing of graffiti and extrapolating that across a city or a country, and that's just not the case. So get informed, read. At Mexico News Daily, when this issue became really hot a couple months ago, we had some of our Mexican-born writers write about their perspective in their cities of gentrification and immigration, and just get informed and educated. And if anything, it'll only inspire you more to want to come. It's not gonna make you scared.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thank you, Travis. Another great episode.
All right, until next
Appreciate
time.
it.
Thank you, George. Take care.
All right, man.